Hello once again, this is Tony Wright, First Love Christian Church, or FLCC, and A.B. Wright Ministries. We're in the 90-day Bible study. We're on day 28. We're in 2 Kings 15, chapter 27th verse, through the 25th chapter and the 30th verse. Boy, so Israel has been going through kings like Charles Barkley through golf balls. Man, and God has had more than enough. Now, he's given them warning after warning, and forgiven, but they just refuse to walk in his ways, and they're determined to follow every god but him. So as we enter into today's reading, we see that these last few judges of Israel are just knocking each other off and taking over reign for themselves. So Azariah, or as we often refer to him, Uzziah, was reigning in Judah, and Zechariah began his reign in Israel. And Zechariah was the son of Jeroboam II. And Zechariah was only in power for 6 months before Shalom killed him and took the throne. Then this dude was in power for 1 month before Menahem killed him and assumed power. Now, Menahem was able to remain in power for 10 years. But during that time, he was paying off the king of Assyria so he wouldn't come and overtake them. But he died, and his son, Pekahiah, took over reign in Israel. Well, for 2 years. Then Pekah killed him, took the throne. And as you might have seen, for the most part, the kings in Israel were now only looking at the throne as a way to, rake in privilege for themselves and for their families. Now, Pekah reigned for 20 years, but during his time of reign, Assyria came in and took the territories of Ijon, Janor, Kedesh, Hazor, Gilead, Galilee, and then Hoshea killed him and took over the throne. Meanwhile, in the south, in Judah, after Azariah, who had reigned for 52 years, died, his son Jotham began to reign, and this was during Pekah's second year of reign, and he reigned for 16 years as a good king, by the way. Now, you did notice that there were no good kings in Israel after the kingdom was divided, right? In northern Israel, no good kings. But like many other kings in Judah, although he did right in the sight of the Lord, Jotham, he didn't destroy the high places. And now, as we see these terms, high places, realize that most often it refers to places of pagan religious practices. That's all. And it's translated from a Hebrew word, bama, which can mean ridge or elevated place, but we just pagan worship. Now, keeping in mind at this time, most worship places were actually located at the highest points found. They considered the highest points closer to heaven where the gods live. So anyway, let's get up. So after Jotham died, his son Ahaz reigned. And after that, Judah had 4 kings that at least tried to do what was right in the sight of the Lord. Not so for Ahaz. This joker was whacked for sure. He did all kinds of foolishness, including sacrificing his son and all kinds of idol worship. Well, the kings of Syria and Israel came to war against Judah. And although Syria, took some territory, they couldn't overthrow Judah. Then Ahaz went to Assyria and gave the king silver and gold that he had and asked for his help to defend Judah against Syria and Israel. And Assyria went to Damascus in Syria, and they captured the people. Then Ahaz went to Damascus to meet the Assyrian king, and he saw this altar while he was there. So he sent the plans for that altar back home to the high priest, Urijah. And Urijah built one just like it. Then when he returned home, Ahaz, he went up and offered sacrifices on that altar. Then he changed their entire worship process, and he removed things from the tent, every kind of foolishness, trying to please the Assyrian king instead of God. Boy, we better know that any time that we're more concerned with pleasing any man instead of God, we're on a short path to destruction. You best believe that. You hear me? Now, when Ahaz died, his son Hezekiah reigned in his place. But in Israel, Pekah had been killed and replaced by Hoshea. And Assyria had warred against Israel, and Hoshea was like a servant to their king. Now Hoshea would give him presents every year and was basically paying for Israel's freedom. Then the king thought that Hoshea was trying to conspire against him because he stopped giving him these presents. So he was taken and thrown into prison. And Assyria then attacked Israel, and in what would have been Hoshea's 9th year in reign, Assyria took Israel captive. So after all their disobedience, they were swept away just like God had promised. And Judah wasn't faring a great deal better. God continued to warn, and Judah, just like Israel, continued to do their own thing. So Israel had totally rejected God's statutes and commandments. The covenant that God had made with their forefathers had gone unheeded. And they had just, left God's commandments and made molten images. And they worshiped Baal and all other idol gods. So because they had rejected God, God was now rejecting them. And as all the prophets that had been sent by God to warn them had said, they were now carried away captive into a distant land. And the king of Assyria, he resettled the land of Samaria with his people. And boy, if you thought there was some foolishness and idol worship going on before Israel left Samaria, you ain't seen nothing. Man, now, woo-wee. Anyway, fast forward, back to Judah. So where Ahaz had died and Hezekiah had become king. And Hezekiah was another king in Judah that did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And he removed the high places and broke down the images, cut down the groves. And now in most instances, when you see the term groves, especially as found here, it just often refers to the poles that were used in worship to the fertility goddess Asherah. What in the world? So with all the prophets affirming God's blessing power to the children, to give children to barren couples, time after time after time, these people would rather go out and worship some symbol and call out to it in hopes of bearing children instead of calling on a God that has proven that not only that he can come through, but that he will come through. Oh, help me somebody. Anyway, Hezekiah, he cleaned those up too. Now, even the brass serpent that Moses held up to protect them from the plague of serpents in the desert, Hezekiah had destroyed that because these people were even burning incense to this brass serpent. What in the world? But Hezekiah, he was straight. And after Assyria had captured Samaria, they came against Judah. And Hezekiah gave, gold and silver to the king so that they wouldn't be overtaken. But Assyria, they continued to taunt Judah and demand more and more tribute. And they told the people of Judah that Hezekiah had fooled them and, had them thinking that there was a God that could protect them and rescue them from the Assyrians. And they said that there was no God of any country that had been able to stop them from being overtaken. And Jerusalem would be no different. So Hezekiah, he sent to Isaiah the prophet for counsel. And Isaiah told him not to fear, over what the Assyrians were saying, that Assyrians had blasphemed and the king would die by the sword in his own land. But the Assyrians, they sent word again to Hezekiah, not to let his God deceive him into thinking that Jerusalem would somehow be delivered from the hands of the Assyrians. And when Hezekiah got that letter, he started to pray. Oh boy. When you start to pray, when you really start to pray, boy, something is about to happen. You hear me? Now Hezekiah prayed, save us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord God, even you only. And Isaiah, he sent word to Hezekiah that the prayer that he prayed, that the Lord had heard it. And that same night, an angel of the Lord went through the camp of the Assyrians and killed 185,000 Assyrians. So the rest of them, they hurried up and returned on back to Nineveh. They skedaddled, you know what I'm saying? So sometime after that, this king's own sons killed him, and one of them took over the throne of Assyria. Now, Hezekiah, he actually later became sick, and he was dying. And Isaiah the prophet visited him and told him that God had said for him to set his house in order because he would die and not live. But Hezekiah, he turned his face to the wall and he prayed. Oh boy, here we go, prayer. Let me tell you. And he asked the Lord to remember how faithful he had been and how he had served God in truth and with a pure heart. And Hezekiah cried before the Lord. And the Lord told Isaiah to tell Hezekiah that God had heard his prayer and seen his tears, and he would be healed in 3 days, and he would be 15 years would be added to his life. Boy, don't anybody try to tell me that prayer won't change some things. Oh my goodness, you hear me? Now Hezekiah, he asked for a sign that he would be healed. And Isaiah told him, asked him, what do you want, the sundial shadow to move forward or backwards 10 degrees? Hezekiah said, well, it's too easy for the shadow to move forward. I want it to go back 10 degrees. So Isaiah cried out to God, and God moved the shadow back 10 degrees. What? You know what that means, right? The sun backed up. Oh, buddy, these dudes, they don't play, do they? If they aren't dialed into God, no one has ever been dialed in. Do you hear me? Boy, but eventually Isaiah returned, and this time with the message that Judah would be taken into captivity by Babylon, and there would be nothing left. Bzz. Let's fast forward a little bit. So after Hezekiah died, his son Manasseh began to reign, and he reigned for 55 years. But he was the opposite of his father. Boy, he built back the place of idol worship and the altars for Baal, and he made a grove. Boy, what is it with these guys? So God said that he would forsake his remnant and deliver all of them into the hands of their enemy. And after Manasseh died, his son Amon reigned. But he was killed after 2 years, and his son Josiah became king. Now, Josiah followed after his grandfather's ways, and he walked in the ways of the Lord. And his high priest, Hezekiah, found the book of the law and gave it to the scribe to take to the king. And his scribe read the book of the law to Josiah, and Josiah was devastated for his people. And he sent Hezekiah and the others to the prophetess to see what was going to become of Judah's people. Now, she told them that God was not pleased at all with his people, and for the fact that his people had forsaken his ways and walked according to their own desires. But that because of Josiah's heart, this destruction that would come upon Judah would not come during his time. So Josiah, he read the book of the law before his people, and he commanded that all the high places be torn down and the groves. And Josiah, he reinstated the Passover, which they hadn't observed for a year. But God did not withdraw his charge of wrath toward Judah for the evil that Manasseh had done. So after Josiah's death, his son Jehoaz reigned in his place. But, well, this was for 3 months. And the king of Egypt put another son, Eliakim, who the king renamed to Jehoiakim, in charge, and took Jehoaz back to Egypt, where he eventually died. But after Jehoiakim died, he was replaced by Jehoiachin, who was taken captive into Babylon and replaced by an uncle that the Babylonian king named Zedekiah. But just as God had said, Judah was taken into captivity by Babylon. So after all the pleas for obedience and to walk according to God's statutes, God had finally had enough. And all of his people had been removed even from the land of promise and taken into strange lands to serve people there. Not a word that God had spoken had not come true. And if they had only listened, and the same is true for us. We know that God's word is true, but time after time after time, we choose just to go our own way, do our own thing, and we pay the price. Hey, but this word is free. So you just keep reading the word and you keep checking us out on your favorite social media platform. And always remember, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. FLCC, we're on the move, brothers and sisters. We're taking ministry back to the first love. We love you. Agape style. Peace.